go ahead and call this meeting to order this evening, and I'll take a motion to approve the June 6, 2019 agenda.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All
Aye.
opposed? Perfect. Moving on to the approval of the minutes of our May 2nd, 2019 meeting. A motion to approve.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Great. Moving on, as Laura walks in, to turn it over to the staff report on procedure for the final plat for PC 2019-07.
Good evening. This is a relatively simple and straightforward application for a final plat for a lot that was previously platted by the city. In this case, final plats are reviewed just to ensure their conformance with the adopted preliminary plat. There's no public hearing because that was held during the preliminary plat approval. The Planning Commission makes a recommendation of approval with conditions or disapproval to the City Council for their final action. That's our procedure. Would you like me to just keep going?
I would.
Sure. So this is, as I mentioned, replat of Lot 2 to divide the platted Lot 2 into two parcels. If you review this against our criteria for subdivision, staff has no concerns. As I said, this is relatively simple and straightforward. We do find it to be in conformance with the approved preliminary plat. The plat as attached does reference, so that we're clear, a 10-foot utility easement that was previously dedicated to the city with the previous plat. So there are no additional easements that are contained in this replat, and we would recommend approval of the replat of Lot 2.
Any questions from anybody on that? Okay, I'll entertain a motion on PC 2019-07.
I make a motion that we accept the final plat of PC 2019-07 as presented to us.
Second.
All in favor? Aye. All opposed? Great.
Okay, this will appear on the June 18th City Council agenda for final approval.
Thank you. As they're going to move on to PC 2019-08, staff report.
Sure. So this item says on the agenda, conditional use permit. It's actually not. Most parking things that come before you are, but in this case, we are just requesting your approval to increase the on-site parking on this particular piece of property. So it's not a public hearing. You are the final decision maker in this case. We do have the applicant, a representative of the Quick Trip Corporation here, and we can have them start by presenting their request.
Great, thank you.
Good evening. My name is Eric Eckhart of Quick Trip Corporation. Do you have that PowerPoint available? So put together a couple slides on a PowerPoint just to try to help better explain to you guys what we're requesting here. But like Sarah said, our site plan, yeah, you can start there. So this is a copy of our proposed site plan. What we're requesting is a total of 59 parking stalls. By code, we are allowed to have 24, and if you go up to the 150% max increase, it puts us at a total of 36. So on this plan, I've just highlighted a couple of the stalls here to try to help better explain what corporately our thought process is behind the way we kind of design these stores and help better understand the need for the excessive parking. So in the red there, you see there's highlighted, I think it's a total of 14 stalls. So those are designated strictly for employee parking. With these new style stores, we typically average about 6 to 7 employees during the daytime. So as you can imagine, shift change time, that doubles. So that's why we account for those spaces. There's one little spot in orange that's highlighted as well, which is counted in our total parking, but it's really just truly the air pump. So it's not meant for someone to park, come into the store, or anything like that. And then, of course, the 3 blue there are the ADA accessible stalls. So if you take those out, then that knocks our total, what we consider to be usable stalls, down to a total of 41. So for a reference point, I counted the stalls at the existing store before we came in, and it's got 38. And I'm sure you guys have probably been by there during busy times, and there's some capacity issues that we have. So part of the need for that. These next few slides, I just put in a couple of site plans from our recent stores that we've built in the city close by, just to kind of give you an idea that What we're looking to do here is not anything that is kind of out of our norm corporately. There's a lot of research that goes into designing these sites and the need for these stalls. So this site here, we recently opened up in Liberty, Missouri off of 291 Highway, and just to give you a reference point, this has a total of 80 parking stalls. And that counts everything, not just employees and, the ones that counted out. This next one here is off North Oak Traffic Way. It's a relocated store, but it has a total of 94 parking stalls. And then one more here, just to give you kind of an idea of something similar to what we're doing. This is the old store off of 68th Street and 169 that just recently opened. So this is the old layout that we remodeled, and it had a total of 25 parking stalls. If you go to the next slide there, Sarah, this is the new site that just recently opened, and I highlighted to try to make it a little bit easier to follow. But we went from a total of 25 to 56 stalls, so pretty similar to what we're requesting to do here. And then the last slide here, this just shows an example of one of our stores, same style, Generation 3, that has what we would consider to be limited parking. And this is just pulled from Google Earth, so I'm not sure what the time is. It may be a peak period, it may not be. But as you can see, there's really only 5 or 6 open stalls. We've got several cars that are either circling the lot, looking for somewhere, and it causes congestion issues. Typically what we see is people start circling the lot, and there's potential safety issues. People aren't getting in and out of the store like we designed. So that's kind of the detailed explanation of why we're requesting what we are here. So with that, we would request that you approve these additional stalls outside of the code, and I can answer any questions that you may have.
Any questions? Anybody?
Are you all providing any bike parking?
We are, yeah. There's bike rack in front of the store.
Can you go back to the site plan?
It's probably called out on there, but it's going to be in fine print. So
Yeah, just,
just
generally.
for reference point, where the blue parking stalls are right in front of the store. It's the 80 ramp. There's a door right in front of there, and just offset from that, there's a picnic table area, and a bike rack up against between the building and the picnic tables there.
How many stalls does the current store across the street have now?
The
Do you
one
know?
right behind
Yeah.
us, it has 38,
Okay.
and that takes into account the employees and the vendor stalls and all that as well.
Are there going to be more employees at this store than
Yeah.
that store?
Yeah, typically on average, and it's all volume based, so it just depends on how busy it is. And we run programs that do a pretty good job of estimating those. But on average, we employ 2 to 3 more employees per shift at these new style stores than we do the old ones, just because of the square footage and there's more work to do. So, and then it's
Yeah.
shift change. When people are kind of overlapping, those numbers typically can go as high as 12 to 14 people at a time.
Any more questions? If no more questions, I'll entertain a motion on this case.
I move that we accept conditional use permit PC 2019-08 as presented to us.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Perfect. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Moving on to the zoning ordinance adoption, PC 2018-06. And Sarah, I'll turn it over to you for a report on procedure.
Thank you. We're excited to be at this point with you all tonight, considering the adoption of a new zoning ordinance. So I'll say the procedure for this is the same procedure that we would use for any rezoning case or zoning text amendment, where we have advertised the public hearing for tonight that you will hold. We published notice in the Kansas City Star, and we mailed some public notices. We are not required to mail notice to everyone in the city. We mailed notice to anyone who owned property within 185 feet of a change in the proposed new zoning map. So there was a subset of people in the city and in the city of Kansas City, Missouri, who received notices about the public hearing tonight. So one of the things you'll notice in the resolution for this case is a whereas clause, or there's a clause where you find the notice to have been sufficient for the public hearing. So you will hold the public hearing tonight about this whole process, and then make a recommendation to the city council for their consideration, or you can table the public hearing and take more comment from people at a future date. After, months and months of the work that has gone into this, I hope that, everything will go smoothly tonight. That's the procedure. Since the city is also the applicant, we would be happy to give our report on this application at this time if you'd like me to keep going.
Please do, Sarah.
And then you can open the public hearing. But Chris Brewster is here tonight, who's been working with us on this project for so long from Gould Evans. And Chris can take it from here.
Thanks, Sarah. Chris Brewster with Gould Evans, 4200 Pennsylvania, Kansas City, Missouri. I'm going to try to go through this as quick as possible, since I know for a lot of you this will be review and repeat, but for the benefit of anyone from the public that's here, just to give a quick overview of the extent of things and key items to focus on where we're recommending changes. So project overview, applicability of the new standards, that's always a question we have of when standards are changing, how does it apply and when? What are the major themes of things that we're changing? A summary of our public engagement steps throughout the process, and then the next steps after this meeting. So originally when this project started, these were the main goals: to align the regulations with the master plan that you all completed in 2016, build on all of the plan policies and concepts, have an engagement strategy that involves stakeholders and inform them, improve urban design and community character elements throughout. That's a very strong element of the master plan, and so that's a key point. Clarify requirements and build expectations. Whenever we do any of these projects, that's where a lot of our focus is to, we're dealing with ordinances that have been amended and over time, and they kind of get pulled apart, and different things were written at different periods, and they don't always align. And so a lot of what we're doing is just helping users better understand what's required and when. And then the last part is build on a lot of the economic development and investment strategies that are in your master plan as well, to make sure this is a community that's business friendly, and everyone kind of moving in the same direction with the design and physical form that's called for in your plan. Overall, this is our scope and schedule, 6 main phases, and I'll walk through some of the key elements of that. January 2018 is when we kicked this off, so a little over a year and a half ago. So it's been a long road, but a good road, I think, and we gradually went through the steps. These are all the meetings that were held with this group or our advisory committee, which involved 2 stakeholders from the community, Richard Lanning and Ryan Tull, for residential and then commercial and industrial property owner representatives as well. So appreciate all of their time and effort in helping us steer this project as well. Quick summary of the master plan. Again, most of everything we changed, we took from one of these policies in the master plan: grow business opportunities, expand population, create memorable places, build a multimodal network, and then enhance the community character. So those are the key elements of your plan, and that's how we organize this project. We also looked a little bit towards this map here, which let us put some of those policies on the ground and into the distinct places of your community. But this is the master plan frameworks map. It doesn't necessarily align with zoning districts, and it shouldn't. But this is sort of a long-range goal of where you want to see things develop and how you coordinate lots of different things. So these areas came into play with some of our strategies in the zoning updates as well. The last part of the master plan, these 5 goals here are, the master plan had a very detailed review of your development regulations, and it recommended these 5 strategies be a follow-up step. And so we looked very seriously at all of these. Modernize the overall ordinance. That's just making sure you're using the latest techniques and strategies. Things are written as clearly as possible. Eliminate pyramidal uses in districts. What that means is your current zoning regulations just simply encompass all of the uses that are in a lower class district. So your residential districts being the lowest ones and your industrial being the highest intensity. The uses just sort of mounted as you went through those districts, and that can create some problems. It's good to be mixing things, but it's also good to be doing that strategically, and so we followed up on that. Form-based approaches for downtown, that's a new technique being used to shift the emphasis of regulations more on the urban design and the scale of development and less on the land uses, and so that approach often leads to better mixed-use pedestrian-oriented environments like you have downtown, and so we followed up on that strategy. In relation to that, eliminate the Burlington Corridor overlay, and as it had some good ideas, but lots of problems with implementation. So I think we've got a strategy that keeps those good ideas, but gets rid of a lot of the complications. And the last one, establish a open space and park requirement. We didn't necessarily go that far, but we did tie in a lot of the civic gathering place elements that your plan calls for in some of the mixed use areas, and then also improved on the landscape standards in the current ordinance to get better site design throughout the city. One of our key deliverables when we launched the project, our first one was the plan conformance report, where we took those recommendations from the master plan and analyzed them against the code. So that was organized under these main themes that match very closely with the master plan, and we went through section by section to see where the code was strong or weak, and that kind of gave us a framework for what we wanted to change and why. So this is a quick summary of those things that we want to change. Simplification, grouping common topics, getting better cross-references, getting tables and graphics wherever we could. The ordinance has a lot of flexibility in it now, and one of the things we try to do is put more flexibility in where it's needed, but also improve on flexibility by having better decision-making criteria in there as well. So every time we want to give options or put you all in a position where you can give exceptions or approve something different, we want to make sure we have some decision-making criteria in that process, and then on the backside have more intent statements with the regulation you're deciding to give an exception to. In other words, what were we trying to accomplish with that regulation, and is this what's being proposed and equal or better, or is it a situation where we weren't going to accomplish that anyway, so that the exception makes sense? So those types of things are in the procedures to make the code work a little bit better. Housing options, I'll go into that in a little bit more detail here on one of the next couple slides. As I mentioned, urban design and social spaces, that's that open space and gathering places element of your plan. Commercial and mixed use strategies, I'll go into a little bit of examples on what we did with the use table and how we reconciled that idea of getting rid of the pyramidal uses among districts, but also allowing things to mix a little bit more. And then lastly, our analysis showed that there were some issues to be looked at on the parking and landscape design. Quickly on when the regulations will apply, generally an easy rule to think of is it will not make anything happen. It's going to take someone having to invest in their property before the new regulations will apply. So there's your first rule of thumb. Anything that's there now under the existing ordinance can remain there as long as it's a viable, maintained property. So it won't necessarily make anything happen. There's a further refinement. A lot of the sections might have an applicability statement. An easy example would be the landscape and parking sections. When someone does some certain things that would trigger a site plan review, you won't necessarily be able to bring the entire site into compliance. So there's some rules that help you layer and filter in some of the requirements so that they're gradually becoming more conforming without the entire site having to conform. And then lastly, there's always the non-conforming situations section of your ordinance that you have right now that will remain, that deals with things that have been legal from prior approvals, and they need to keep being a viable property and to maintain and invest in. And so those rules also help with making sure you don't catch someone off guard and trying to force them to do something when it's not an appropriate time. So the major themes on what's changing and why. The first one is the use table. We generalized more by types of uses, but we distinguished more on the scale of uses. So I have an example of the use table that we'll go through that. But there's an example of where we were adding more flexibility where it's warranted, but we were also trying to make some distinctions between things where the difference would have been important. So for example, certain things that go in downtown have a much different scale than things that go out further east on Armour Road. And so the C2 zoning district, your downtown zoning district, should have a different scale to the uses than the ones that are allowed in general commercial. So that's just an easy way to think of how we simplified the table. For housing, Another major theme, the plan called for more housing options. What these code amendments will do, they'll enable what's called the missing middle, some of those very small-scale housing types, but they might have a high density because of the number of uses in them, and they're going on a smaller lot. They fit well into neighborhoods, but your zoning districts didn't have a very good path or avenue for them. And so we enabled those, but in exchange for that, there's more neighborhood design standards to make sure those types of projects fit in as well. What were labeled the urban areas form-based code regulations, that's following up on that idea of let's implement a form-based code for downtown. When we went to do that, it was hard to draw the boundaries of where you would stop doing that. It wasn't necessarily matching up with your C2 zoning district. It wasn't necessarily matching up with the downtown character area that's in your downtown plan. So we started to look at it as just the whole urban areas, downtown and the old industrial area, and then came up with a strategy to regulate those by street type and frontage type so that you could get appropriate transitions in there. And so I'll talk about that a little bit here in a moment as well. Again, commercial design citywide, landscape standards and standards to get the buildings and sites to relate more to the streetscape. Parking, improving on some of the flexibility that's already in there in the code and giving some more specifics, but then also having better design standards so that when there is large parking that we're mitigating the impacts of that on both adjacent properties and on the streetscape. And then landscape standard, having some more specific standards. You currently just have the requirement to submit a plan, but there's no guidance on what needs to be in that plan, so this code will do that. Overall, the organization of the code is much simpler. On the left is the current table of contents, and really it's just a sort of a long list of sections. They don't necessarily all relate well to one another. And so the new organization is all the way on the right, so a much simpler setup where we're trying to get all of the design standards into one article for residential and one article for non-residential, all of the districts and use standards in one article, and then having those special topics dealt with individually, open space, parking, and then the last one, supplemental standards. That's kind of the catch-all for things that are just regulated citywide. Cellular communications, I think flood, what was the other? I think that one was in use. Wireless, mobile homes, things that don't fit well into the districts, the district structure that were just kind of individual topics. That's what's in the supplemental standards. It's sort of that catch-all article for things that are maybe easy to forget as well. The graphic in the middle is what we call the section map, and we did that at the final draft, and I believe that's on the website. What that is we went through section by section of your existing code and then showed where we were moving it over under this new structure, and then had some comments on what might be changing and why in that approach, or if maybe we were getting rid of that section altogether. We use that as just a check on ourselves to make sure we're not throwing out things that you need, or we're not changing things that are working well. So that's been on the website, I believe, with all of the final draft documents. So if anyone has any concerns with certain sections, you can go to this document and try to trace it to where you might find it in the new code, and look at how maybe it was treated differently. This will be something that we'll continue to use before we get the full adoption draft on to make sure we've caught everything, and it's just a good thing to help do our final cleanup before the formal adoption and the regulations go into place. Here's an example of the use table. So what we did, the current zoning ordinance has kind of a long list of uses in each district, and they aren't always treated the same among different districts because they were written sort of independently and maybe and amended maybe at different times. So they between one zoning district and another, the list of uses started to become a little bit inconsistent. Something might have been called something in one district, and something similar might have been called the same thing in another district, or maybe slightly different. So it led to some interpretation issues. And incidentally, that was one of our biggest challenges on the Burlington Corridor overlay when that was being looked at, trying to keep all of the base districts in place, but knowing that some uses were called different things in different districts. So we built this use table that's just going to govern them all, and so it's an easy, quick reference to things. When we did that, we saw the opportunity to compress a lot of things into one particular type of use. So an easy way to think of that is retail. There was lots of different things that could be considered retail that were listed, and so we just said retail is retail is retail. The real difference is the scale of that retail, and that helps us figure out where that type of retail should go, not necessarily what they may be selling, but what's the scale of that use. And so there were several other instances similar to this where we were able to generalize the use into a category, but then further refine it based on the scale and start to figure out which districts a certain scale belonged in versus another. So one of the key places where that refinement helped was your C1, C2, and C3 zoning districts. So neighborhood commercial, downtown commercial, more highway-oriented commercial. The list of uses were almost exactly the same among those districts. So having things separated by scale let us refine those a little bit more and really repurpose the neighborhood C1 district to more neighborhood-oriented retail, repurpose the downtown more to that urban pedestrian scale environment, and then C3 for the larger scale, more auto-oriented things that you might find. The other part about the uses and districts that changed, we were able to eliminate or recharacterize some. So the Burlington Corridor overlay, as I mentioned, is removed, and that's being replaced by since that's included in our urban areas form-based layer, that's going to be taking care of that, which I'll speak to in a moment here. The public civic district we removed. That district wasn't used or mapped anywhere, and it included a lot of open space, public uses, institutional uses, and those are things that we allowed anyway in all of the zoning districts for the most part because they're part of, they have a lot of civic and urban design aspects to them that we want integrated in the districts. We don't necessarily need a different district to allow them. So the thought was that it's unnecessary, so let's just remove the district, particularly since it hadn't been mapped or used at all. That's a good signal that you don't need it. As I mentioned, recharacterizing C1 more towards neighborhood. Then the last one, this is kind of a big one. The CO district is where the hospital was zoned CO, but what that district originated as was I believe it stands for commercial office. And so it's a non-retail zoning district. And the intent of it usually is that you can integrate that better with neighborhoods. And so a lot of your smaller pockets that were zoned CO were intended to be that sort of a lesser intensity commercial district. However, the hospital was zoned that as well, and we suspect simply because hospital was a listed use in CO, therefore let's rezone it CO. But none of the development standards really matched up with what you have going up on the hospital, a more campus-oriented environment. So since the biggest part of the area was zone CO was the hospital, we thought, why don't we just reclassify that district as CIO, commercial institutional office, so it could be that large-scale campus environment. So all of the standards were recharacterized for that type of development pattern. And then what that left was, okay, the last few pieces that are zone CO, they need to find a different district going forward because they're not in a context where you would want that scale of development. So some of the map amendments I think most of the map amendments are going along with this effort, which I think Sarah can talk to, are dealing with that. Housing and neighborhoods. So we took a bit of a strategic approach here to pick when we were building in new options, we wanted to pick, one, the district where it would be most appropriate to build in options, but two, the district that was least mapped. So we aren't making any wholesale changes to things that are currently mapped on the ground. So it'll mostly be a proactive approach where for someone to use some of these new options, they're going to need to seek a rezoning request. Not in all cases, but in most. And in the cases where they wouldn't, it seemed appropriate anyway. But this table reflects all of what we would call the different housing types, that middle blue column, from the lowest scale on the top to the larger scale on the bottom. So the gap there in the middle that's not highlighted red, those are the things that weren't easily accounted for under your current zoning district standards. Other than that, all the things going across in the table, the dimensions would match your current regulations, what your zoning ordinance says right now. So we knew we had to find something for those pieces in the middle. So when we wrote the standards for those types of buildings, row house, small apartment, medium apartments, the ideal district for them was the R4 zoning district. So you can see there that that's where they're most easily allowed or allowed by right, so to speak. So that was our strategy. It won't change a lot on the ground, but it'll also enable a lot of new things going forward that your master plan calls for. So it's a housing type approach rather than a density approach. So all of these, this is the range of building types that the code is calling for. The reason we take a housing type approach, the row house, small apartment, medium apartment, the density of those projects can be quite high, even though the scale of them is low and they fit well into your community. So they didn't have a good fit in your zoning ordinance because your other districts were capping the density and didn't really address building scale. So that is why we took this approach. It's really kind of stealing a page from a project you know well and are experienced with. The Northgate project has all of those types in it, basically. The smaller lot, single family, the row houses, and then the smaller apartments as well. So that's really the intent of this district, is to, projects like Northgate are smaller scale, infill opportunities that have some of those housing types in them. The R4 zoning district is going to be the one that's most readily set up for these types of projects. Moving quickly, stop me if you have any questions or want to discuss any of these as well. So the urban areas form-based regulations, our approach was to basically let all of the development questions for this area be addressed by two maps. A form map that was going to go by street and frontage type, and what that map will talk about, it will talk about where should the front building line be on this lot, where should we have building entrance features and how frequent and how many, what should the transparency be of this, in other words, what's the relationship to the streetscape, windows, doors, openings, how do we activate streets on some streets, maybe we don't care about it as much on others. Similarly, blank wall limits and parking limits, where do we want to limit things that become sort of those barriers to pedestrian activity. So a street map helps you do that and define areas where you care about it the most and areas where you care about it the least. And then the second map that would control everything was the zoning district map, and that would handle uses and lot standards and all those development standards. And so our recommendation is to actually not touch that, to leave everything as it is now in place. So the industrial districts moving further as you move further to the south, and then a lot more mixed-use activity as you get into the core and down Swift. There will be opportunities to change that over time as you have new projects, whether it would be introducing new residential projects into this area. Again, the R4 zoning district would be ideal for that, and there are sites within here that we've identified that we think would be likely suspects to entertain that in the future, and it would be consistent with your master plan. But this effort doesn't do that. That's left for a different day to determine. And similarly, there would be other areas where you might want to rezone to your C2 district to allow more commercial and mixed-use projects going forward as well. So a little bit more on regulating the frontages. These are the types of things we're looking at. A frontage type that talks about where the building sits and how that building might be designed, everything from a neighborhood scale up to a more urban or commercial scale. We came up with the concept by really surveying a lot of the existing areas and started to see some of these patterns exhibit themselves. And so this terminology of walkable A, B, and C streets came into light, that there's certainly a higher degree of urban design on your most important streets. Some of those elements I talked about, windows, doors, transparency, how close the building relates. And then some of the streets that were still quite walkable but didn't have a great interface with the building because they weren't as important are the walkable C. And then you get into the industrial areas where the service A and B streets, where it's purely about the function of the space and not necessarily the urban design elements as much. And then the last was to treat the Boulevard Gateway one was the element that helps us get rid of the Burlington Corridor overlay, because it talks about some of the same things and more of an incremental strategy for that area, since it's since it's a little bit messy going down there, and you don't always know when you're going to want to upgrade and bring things up to the street. And so it's a more of a options and opportunities approach for that Boulevard Gateway frontage type. But this is the final map. We went through several iterations of this and with you all, with the council and with some of our stakeholders to try to get this right. But basically, it's the red and orange are the highest level of pedestrian orientation. The blues are a little bit lesser, and then black is the ones where it's just quite messy, and it's fine to be that way. Some of the more it roughly matches up with your zoning district. So M2 heavy industrial and M1 light industrial on those service streets, but it's not a one-for-one match, and we think that's good because what we're saying is zoning districts handle the uses. Where you're located and how you relate to the public street handles what urban design standards you'll be held to. So that was the overall strategy for this. So in a way, it's taking some of the complexity of form-based codes and really simplifying it, and then that's what allowed us to say we could apply this approach to the entire older urban areas because it has a very gridded pattern, and it's what's appropriate is highly influenced by how the streets are laid out in that area. This is an example of some of the standards that go along with it. We're basically looking at the building placement. How does the primary entrance feature, how does the building interact with the street, either very high level or low level? Same thing with facade transparency, and same thing with some of the massing and modulation details. Incidentally, this approach also allowed us to get away with your C2 district currently has downtown design guidelines. And so everything those guidelines addressed are talked about in these topics and in this table. And so it was a way to, one, allow us to back off on what would otherwise have been required by your C2 design guidelines, because an area might be in C2, but it also might be on a walkable C frontage where a lesser degree of those design standards might have been appropriate. In the same sense, it allowed us to expand some of the topics that were talked about in your C2 design guidelines by applying it to areas that weren't necessarily zone C2. Those same types of things are still important, even if to a lesser degree. Last two topics quickly, parking. We included that in just an overall comprehensive section on access, parking, and circulation, so opportunities to improve standards for pedestrian access, maintaining a lot of flexibility and actually increasing it. So C2, your downtown district exempt. We did build in a credit for on-street parking. That caused a lot of discussion in our focus groups because there was some concern that we were actually going to be requiring on-street parking, but that's not the case. The case is where on-street parking exists, it can go to someone's parking count. Where it doesn't exist, obviously, they couldn't just put it in unless Public Works approved something for on-street parking. We're of the opinion that if they do, if someday some of the streets that don't have it now do have on-street parking, that would be okay, but that decision on whether that street should have on-street parking or not is not necessarily part of this project. And then a bicycle parking credit, and then requiring it in some situations for certain uses and for areas that are in close proximity to the bike network. That maximum, you currently have a parking maximum, so we heard that tonight. So I think we may have improved on that a little bit, of giving a little bit more leeway, so it's not just a hard maximum, but when you go over it, what we're really looking for is if someone really has a parking intensive use, or feels they really need parking in some context, it does warrant a little bit closer review. And what we're looking for is maybe increased mitigation from that, so it's not impacting either the context of the area too great or the streetscape. So things that can improve it when someone's providing a larger or excessive amount of parking. Shared parking and alternative parking plans accepted. Currently, I think you do that by special use permit, so getting that a little bit more. That was mainly cleaning up the process, putting in some default standards that makes it a little bit easier for a shared parking plan to be approved. And then lastly, just coordinating it with the landscape standards, which is the segue to that. So currently, as I mentioned, the code doesn't have any, although it requires you to submit a landscape plan. So what we did was we organized a set of landscape standards around some of the different site elements. So the frontage, being the highest priority. We care most about how sites relate to the street and how they're perceived by the general public. Foundation plantings, things that accent the building and kind of tie it into the street. Then parking lot planning, buffers for those occasions when you're trying to mitigate and separate uses. And then the last one, those having standards for those gathering places, giving people basically credit for designing some of the things that you see in the pictures there that are called for in your master plan. There are different types of gathering spaces in different contexts. That's the quick overview of a year's worth or years plus worth of substantive changes. This is a look at the schedule of a lot of our public engagement. As I mentioned, the Planning Commission serving as our advisory committee and our 2 additional stakeholders were instrumental. We also had focus groups where we broadened that stakeholder outreach in March of this year. That set us up for an open house that was held here in April, and then the joint council and planning commission work session late in April. And then Sarah and I have had additional stakeholder meetings. Those have been continually going on in February up and through even a couple weeks ago, where we made some tweaks based on some of those meetings. And then the last component of public engagement is the public hearing tonight. With that, the next steps, you all deliberate, make a recommendation. Council does adopt and approve, and I think we have that scheduled for hopefully late June, as long as there's no hiccups or issues that are uncovered in this formal review process. And then we will have the next step of making sure the code is, the final adoption draft is published and cleaned up. So we have some graphic cleanups we'd like to do, some final formatting cleanup that we'd like to do. And then we're also trying to work with a way of integrating it with MuniCode to get a better online interface, so that there may be the opportunity to even do a map-based interface with all the standards, where you can literally click on a map and summary of what would be required will be coming up. So we've been in discussions with MuniCode about that to improve the user friendliness.
Thanks, Chris. Any questions? Yes.
If there are no questions about that, I did want to review the map with you all. As Chris mentioned, the map is part of the ordinance, in the zoning ordinance. And as we've been starting to finalize everything, we went through the map to identify where there were places we wanted to make changes to the official zoning map. And we sent out letters to 22 private property owners where we had identified a possible change in the map that might be appropriate, asking for their consent to rezone their property as part of this process. We did not hear back from all of them. So the places where we're showing a change in the map tonight are only those places where the property owner has consented to making a change in the map as part of this process. And just to, I don't know how to zoom in here. So everything north of 32nd Avenue, or imaginary 32nd Avenue here, was not part of a zoning district in our previous map. So all of these areas have been zoned as part of this process. This is owned by the hospital. In the hospital's case, we're really just making a change in the name of that zoning district to CIO from CO. So this is, a quasi a rezoning here. Over here by Northgate Village, these are all parcels that when we annexed this property in our swap with Kansas City, Missouri, we never did assign it to a zoning district. 2 of these parcels are owned by the city. We're showing them as R1A because that's our most restrictive zoning district. This is the dog park. This property here is currently undeveloped. And this other property is owned by the Levy District, and they indicated their preference for R4. They have no real plans to develop that property right now, but they liked the idea of having some flexibility there in the future. These properties between the Ruby Tuesday site and Gardens 4 are owned by the city. We're zoning them C3 just in recognition that it's likely that they have a commercial use at some point. They were included in the retail area of Northgate Village, but this could change as the city's plans continue to evolve. These properties here one is Save-A-Lot, and the other is the State Farm office. The property owner consented, or the city and the property owner here consented to change to C3, which made the most sense to us, as these are commercial lots. This is the block that's the last part of Northgate Village, which is likely going to be developed at some point as residential, so R4 provides maximum flexibility. Chris mentioned the one block that was still C0 in the previous ordinance. That was here on Buchanan Street. We have a mix here of some single-family homes, a couple of small parking lots, dental office up here on 23rd Avenue. Our long-term goal would be to have this block all move into the C1 neighborhood retail zoning district. Two of these property owners did not reply to our request to them to rezone the property. So they are remaining CIO. And so there are a couple of changes that the hospital requested to that district, which we said, because we have two lots that are going to remain in that zoning district with you, we're not comfortable making those changes right now. Most of these lots are moving into C1 as part of this map update. Down here at 20th and Clay, the property owner is currently pursuing a row home development here, so they requested a rezoning to R4. And then we have over here in the avenues, this is Knox. This property owner is also, this is the little store here. We're rezoning that to R4. This is the zoning district right here, so that'll just have a little bend in it to allow them to address some issues with the little store. And then this is First Federal Bank, and a sliver of property that the city owns. This to us makes sense to all be C3 down in here. We just didn't get any reply from Wendy's or the NFI, Spanish Aids owns this property here in the corner. Long term, we would love to see all of this corridor as C3. This is the city's lot at 18th and Swift. We're rezoning to R5 as part of our development agreement there for multifamily. City Hall, we're rezoning our entire parcel to C2. Currently, it's split between a C2 and R3. We had one parcel down here that was also split between M1 and M2, and the property owner requested to have the entire parcel in the M2 zoning district. Did I hit everything? There's, as I said, we had a few areas in the city where we would have liked to have made a change, and we didn't get a response from the property owner, so no change was made. But we feel that the changes that are made in the zoning map are in conformance with our master plan and are all changes that make sense with the character of the area and what we know of a property owner's plans for the property. So I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have about the map.
So we can't make a change without property owner's consent.
Well, we could legally, but staff's not comfortable in making that recommendation because there is an impact to the owner, and we would have concerns about property owners who were, didn't consent and then had legal concerns down the road.
Yeah, that's fine. I understand. What would be the process to change that in the future?
It would be a rezoning application.
Okay. Does that have to come before planning or?
Yes.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay. I think with that, we can do the public hearing.
Yes.
Perfect. I hereby open the public hearing on case PC 2019-06.
Is this on?
Yep.
Okay. Richard Lanning, NT Realty. From my position and my group's position, I'd like to thank the city for allowing us to be part of the steering committee. And I appreciate Sarah and Chris's patience and cooperation with me on a couple of tweaks to the plan, but otherwise we're on board with it and think they've done a great job. So thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Anybody else?
Hello, Randy Bossert. I'm with Bossert Service. We own the property on 32nd Street. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. I was talking to Sarah earlier today. Looks like a couple of the pieces that the city owns, the dog park and the one to the east of mine, you're all looking at rezoning as R1. And families got a little bit of concern with that. just because it'll be the only two pieces on that street that'll be residential. Everything else is commercial on that side, and has been for, ever since I've been alive. And we've been on that property 70 years, so, I don't know how that'll work. It'll work out now, but down the road, who knows? We insert two residential spots into a whole row of commercial. It may present problems down the line, I don't know. It'd just be something to think about.
Okay.
So, just wanted to make my concerns known.
I appreciate it.
All right.
Anybody else? Okay, I will ask for a motion to close the public hearing.
Move we close the public hearing.
Second.
All in favor? Aye. All opposed? Great. Thanks. Any other questions? I know I was going to ask a quick question on the, I know Jesse Smith brought up was it 17? I just lost my page. I had it on. I think you know what I'm talking about. I think it's 17-12-5, the requirement that if someone builds an auxiliary, they have to either live in the one they're building or on that property. You know, I'm not here to stand in the way of progress and move forward, but I do tend to agree with his position that I think allowing people to you know, add more density when appropriate meets a lot of the goals that I think that we set out. So I think my question is, I think that correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that what we're looking to do is see how the current one works and then maybe look at opening up down the future. Is that kind of where the city's position is on that, or?
Right, so the standards for accessory dwelling units are in 17.12.030B, accessory dwellings, because we also have accessory structures could include sheds and garages. And we have number 5 under B is the property owner shall occupy either the principal or accessory dwelling as their permanent residence. One of the goals of our master plan is to grow our population, and so adding accessory dwelling units as a permitted accessory definitely helps with that. In the process of hearing feedback from the community, we have not heard a lot of people who are totally opposed to accessory dwelling units. No one has stated that, but we have heard a concern that this is potentially opening up, particularly the River Forest neighborhood, to a change in the character of their neighborhood. If you had more garage apartments, or I don't know if there are a lot of attics, but we heard that concern. Having this requirement that the property owner live on the property definitely puts a limit on how many accessory dwelling units could be developed in North Kansas City. And, you know, it also means that the people who are developing accessory dwelling units are the people who are going to personally benefit from having an ADU in all likelihood. We could certainly remove that and allow any property owner in the city to develop an accessory dwelling unit. We would just need to delete subsection 5 here. And it may be that in a couple of years, we have, you know, a handful of ADUs and everything's going well, and we're directed to bring that amendment forward. We could do that now also, if that was your direction. But in response to the concern that was raised, we included this as a limit on the number of ADUs that could be developed today.
Okay. And what would be the process to ever change that in the future?
It would be a text amendment, which we've done in the past, where we would bring that to you for a public hearing, and then it would go to the city council for approval.
Okay, that sounds probably the best way forward, in my opinion, unless anybody would disagree with that. Okay, thanks, Sarah. I just bring that up. I know he couldn't be here tonight, so. Great. Well, with that, entertain a motion on this case.
I move we approve the proposed zoning ordinance and official zoning map as presented by staff.
Second. Asking for a second. Sorry. Who said that?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Great.
We intend to have this on the city council agenda on June 18th for final approval. Between now and then, we have found a few typos, which we will be correcting from the version that you've approved tonight, and minor editing, as Chris mentioned, just clean up and a couple of graphics that need to be cleaned up a little bit. But those will be the only changes between tonight and the version that will be before council on June 18th. It's a big document. We continue to find little typos here and there.
Great. Good job, everybody. Thanks for all the time you put in on that. This is great. With that,
I would also, if you don't mind, want to take another moment to thank you all for your time and attention in this project, because, you know, it's been a long time coming, and to also thank Richard and Ryan for their time and attention to this. Their input has been really valuable.
great. Yeah, thanks, everybody. Comments from public? Anybody else? Seeing none. Does anybody have any additional comments?
My only additional comment would be to let you know about a public open house we'll be having for the bicycle master plan on Wednesday, June 19th, 5 to 7 at the Parks and Rec Center. This will be the first time we've had a planning meeting up there. This should be a lot of fun, and so I hope that you will plan to stop by. We're going to have Bike Walk KC is going to bring up some e-bikes and scooters for people to try out. We will have some temporary bike lanes marked on Clark Ferguson, so you can take those for a spin around there or around Wheel Park. If you want to bike over, your bike can get a tune-up. We're going to have a bike safety game that I'm not sure is focused on kids or if adults or everyone, but if you want to learn more about bike safety, we're going to have popsicles because hopefully the weather will be nice. And then you can give your feedback on biking in North Kansas City and just the plan in general, but hopefully a lot of fun too. And so cross your fingers for some good weather and join us on Wednesday, June 19th, 2 weeks from yesterday.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Any comments from commissioners? Seeing none, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
Move we adjourn.
Second.
All in favor? All
Aye.
opposed? Great. Thanks, everybody.
Proposal that was happening